All right, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into a really cool philosophy, Mohism.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those that if you're trying to explain it to like another philosopher who's maybe really steeped in like Western traditions,
Yeah,
it's almost like opening up this whole new dimension of thought, right?
for sure.
Because we're talking about ethics, politics, logic, even religion, but with this like very unique Mohist twist.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that Mohism arose in this period in Chinese history called the Warring States period,
Okay.
which was a time of just incredible intellectual vibrancy.
I see.
You could compare it to ancient Greece,
Right.
but it was dealing with its own very unique set of problems that it was trying to find solutions to.
It's like imagine Socrates debating with Confucius.
Yeah,
That would
exactly.
be amazing.
Yeah.
But okay, before we kind of go too far down that hypothetical rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's actually introduce the star of the show, right?
Sure.
We got to talk about Mosey.
Mosey, or Master Mo, is a figure who's as mysterious as he is influential. And he was active in the 5th century BCE, so roughly contemporary with Socrates.
I see.
But you're not going to find like a nice and neat biography of him.
Right.
We don't even know for sure his social status. There's all this debate about where he came from.
Interesting.
Our main source for Mohism is the book called The Mozi,
Okay.
which is actually a collection of texts probably written by a bunch of different people at different times,
Yeah.
spanning from like the 5th to the 3rd centuries BCE.
So we're kind of piecing together a philosophy from like fragments,
Exactly.
which makes it even more intriguing. But there are hints in there, right?
There are.
About who this Mosey character was.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't just this armchair philosopher coming up with theories in isolation.
Right, right.
The Mozi actually suggests he was a very skilled craftsman,
Okay.
maybe even a carpenter.
I see.
There are lots of references to crafts and practical skills in the text.
Makes sense.
And there are even some anecdotes about him being like a military strategist, going around to different states, offering advice on how to defend themselves.
So philosopher, carpenter, strategist.
Right.
This guy had range.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this mysterious figure, right, navigating a chaotic period in Chinese history.
Yeah.
What were the Mohists? What were they even trying to achieve with all this philosophizing?
Well, their core concern was this idea of Z, which is often translated as order.
Okay.
But it's not just any kind of order. It's moral, social, and political stability all wrapped up into one.
Hmm.
And the Mohists believed that this was something that everyone valued, like a kind of universal good.
So unlike some Western philosophers who maybe see like chaos and self-interest as like the starting point for thinking about how humans interact,
Yeah.
the Mohists were saying, no, actually, we all crave order.
Yeah, we all want order.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree on what that order should look like.
Precisely, and that's where their approach gets really interesting. They believed that the key to achieving Z, this order, was unifying moral standards.
I see.
So if everyone agreed on what was right and wrong, then theoretically all this conflict and the social disorder would just vanish.
So unified morality equals social harmony.
Exactly.
That's a bold claim, even for philosophers.
It is.
And it sounds potentially like inflexible.
Yeah.
Did they think that we should just blindly follow tradition?
Well, actually, they had this very sophisticated critique of using tradition, or what the Confucians called lie, ritual propriety, as a basis for ethics.
Okay.
And their argument was that, look, different cultures have all these conflicting customs, some of which might be objectively wrong.
Right.
So simply adhering to tradition doesn't actually guarantee moral correctness.
Okay, so points for recognizing cultural relativism way back then.
Yeah, for sure.
But if tradition wasn't the answer, what was their alternative?
They proposed this idea of fa, which are models or standards.
Okay.
And you can kind of think about these as tools for making correct moral and political judgments.
Like the way a carpenter would use a square to get a perfect right angle.
Uh-huh. So fella are like these moral compasses.
Yeah.
Guiding us toward the right action.
Yeah, exactly.
But where did these faux come from?
Yeah.
What can serve as a model?
They were actually pretty open-minded about that.
Okay.
It could be virtuous agents, like the sage kings of the past.
Mm-hmm.
It could be prototypes, analogies, even abstract concepts like the benefit of the world.
Wow.
Anything that reliably guides us toward good choices could potentially be a fa.
So a pretty diverse toolkit for moral reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm guessing this idea of fa had a ripple effect on other Chinese philosophies.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see thinkers like Zunzi, who was a Confucian,
Right.
And even the legalist philosophers like Han Fei,
Yeah.
they all engage with this concept and really shape their own systems of thought. But to really understand how the Mohists put Fa into practice, we need to kind of dive into their approach to knowledge.
Okay, let's do it.
How do they even define what it means to know something?
Well, for the Mohists, knowledge wasn't about abstract theories. It was about what they called knowledge of.
Okay.
This ability to reliably pick out the real-world things that a word refers to.
So it was very practical, application-focused.
Exactly, yeah.
So knowing something actually meant being able to point to it in the real world,
Yeah,
not just sort of spout theories about it.
exactly.
I bet they had some pretty clever examples to illustrate this point.
They did. A classic one is this example of a blind person
Okay.
who can use the words black and white correctly in sentences,
Hmm.
but can't actually identify black and white objects.
Right.
For the Mohists, this person doesn't truly know black and white.
It's almost like they were anticipating, like the knowing how versus knowing that debate, centuries before modern philosophy even got there.
Yeah.
But this emphasis on application makes sense given their whole focus on fa.
Exactly, because just as a carpenter uses tools to measure and to judge things, FA serve as these kind of public criteria to guide our judgments and to justify what we claim to know.
So fa aren't just tools for moral reasoning.
Yeah,
They're also the foundation of knowledge itself.
in a way, yeah.
But how do you prove that you actually know something using these fa?
Well, they had this really interesting triple check system, you could say, for justifying what they called statements or sayings, and it involved using 3 specific fa.
Okay.
The first was historical precedent, and they especially looked to the example of the Sage Kings.
Hmm.
The second was empirical evidence,
Okay.
so what people can see and hear in the world.
Right.
And then finally, the practical benefit to society when a statement is implemented as policy.
It's like they were combining like tradition and empiricism and pragmatism all in one.
Yeah, it's a really unique blend.
But did they always apply all 3 phi equally?
Well, that's where it gets kind of nuanced. So, for example, when debating things like the existence of ghosts or fate, all 3 standards came into play.
Okay.
But when arguing against things like extravagant music, they thought empirical evidence wasn't really relevant.
I see.
So in those cases, they leaned more heavily on historical precedent and societal benefit.
So it's almost like they understood that different types of knowledge required different types of justification?
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, I have to ask, did this really practical, based approach, did it lead them to develop any kind of formal logic?
That's a really good question. And while they didn't have formal logic like we do today with, symbols and all these rules of inference,
Right.
they did rely very heavily on analogical reasoning.
Okay.
And this was based on their view of judgment as, like, distinguishing one kind of thing from another.
So instead of using abstract symbols, they used comparisons and analogies to make their arguments.
Exactly, yeah.
Can you give us an example of how that worked?
Sure. So imagine they're arguing about whether a specific action is righteous.
Okay.
What they would do is cite a fa for righteousness, like the actions of a sage king.
Right.
Then they'd compare the action in question to that fa, and then make a judgment about whether they're similar enough to belong to the same category.
So it's kind of like a proto-form of analogical inference?
Yeah, you could see it that way.
They were dealing with complex philosophical problems, just using very different tools.
Absolutely.
This is blowing my mind a little bit.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive stuff. And
Yeah.
their approach to politics is equally fascinating.
Okay.
But that's a discussion for our next segment.
All right, cliffhanger.
Yeah.
We'll be back after the break to talk about the Mohist vision of the ideal state. Stay with us. Okay, so we've kind of laid the groundwork now.
Yeah.
We've talked about Z, Fa, knowledge as knowledge of, even a little bit of this like proto-logic. But now let's see how all of this stuff actually plays out in their political philosophy. And remember, like one of the core things about the Mohists is they were so obsessed with order. And that definitely extended to how they envisioned the ideal state.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating how their kind of like state of nature myth differs from the ones that we find in a lot of Western political thought. So instead of it being like Hobbesian self-interest,
Right.
that's leading to this chaos and the need for a social contract, they thought it was conflicting values.
I see.
So it's not that people are like, selfish and just out for themselves.
Right.
It's that everyone thinks they're doing the right thing.
Okay.
but they have wildly different ideas of what right even means.
It's almost the more tragic vision, in a way.
Yeah.
Like a society tearing itself apart not because of, like, greed or selfishness, but because of this genuine moral disagreement.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we climb out of that ethical abyss?
Well, their solution was a virtuous sovereign, the Son of Heaven, who would unify those moral standards and bring everyone kind of like back in line.
So I guess you could think of it as like a kind of philosopher king, but obviously with a very Mohist flavor to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I can see how that would really appeal to their desire for order,
Yeah.
but isn't that just like a huge amount of power concentrated in one person?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, what's to stop this philosopher king from becoming a tyrant, right?
Sure.
Just
Yeah.
imposing their own arbitrary views on everyone else.
Yeah, it's tempting to see it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that it has this kind of like, maybe authoritarian flavor to it.
Right.
But I think the Mohists were a little bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
They really envisioned the state's primary function as being moral education,
I see.
not coercion.
Okay.
So the goal wasn't to just, force people to obey.
Mm.
It was to actually cultivate a society of citizens who understood and internalized these shared ethical standards.
So less about blind obedience, more about kind of like fostering a society of genuinely virtuous individuals.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But how do you actually achieve that?
Yeah.
Did they have a specific method in mind?
They did. They had this really fascinating idea of what they called model emulation,
No.
where individuals would identify upward with the moral judgments of their superiors.
Mm.
So it's very hierarchical.
Yeah.
You start with village heads emulating district heads who emulate lords, all the way up to the Son of Heaven who's supposed to embody the ultimate full.
It's like this cascade of morality.
Yeah.
Flowing down from the top.
Yeah.
But doesn't that sound a little bit stifling?
Yeah.
Like, what about individual freedom, critical thinking?
Hmm.
Surely they didn't just want, like, a society of mindless drones, right?
Yeah, I mean, those are all really valid critiques of this kind of Mohist thought. But I think it's important to remember that the Mohists also place a very high value on reason and argumentation. So identifying upward wasn't just supposed to be this, like, blind faith.
Right. Yeah.
They thought that moral norms could be debated and justified even by subordinates challenging their superiors.
So there was this space for, like, dissent and reasoned critique.
Yeah, if they had.
Okay, that's good. That's reassuring. But still, like,
Yeah.
even if you have a virtuous leader at the very top, what happens if they make bad judgments?
Yeah.
Like, what's the check on their power?
Well, the Mohists, like a lot of other Chinese schools of thought, believed in this idea of the mandate of heaven.
Okay, yeah.
So rulers derived their legitimacy from heaven, and if they became corrupt or unjust, heaven would withdraw its mandate, leading to their downfall.
Ah, so there's this kind of like cosmic accountability system built in.
Yeah, exactly.
Even the philosopher king isn't above moral scrutiny.
Right.
But this emphasis on, like, unified morality and social order, does it leave any room for, like, individual liberty, as we might understand it today?
Well, it's true that they didn't explicitly talk about individual rights in the way that we do.
Right.
But their ethical principle of Jinai, inclusive care, suggests this really deep concern for the welfare of all. So I think you could argue that this implies a commitment to things like fairness and justice, which are necessary conditions for, individuals to actually flourish.
So individual liberty isn't necessarily the primary goal, but maybe like a byproduct
Yeah,
of
potentially.
a just and harmonious society.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's talk about another really key aspect of their political thought, this idea of promoting the worthy.
Yeah.
What do they even mean by that?
Well, they were actually very radical proponents of what we would call meritocracy.
Okay.
So they argued that government positions should be filled based on talent and virtue, not based on social status or family connections.
So a government of, like, the best and the brightest,
Exactly.
regardless of their background. I can see how this really ties into their whole emphasis on achieving those core goods that we talked about earlier. Wealth, order, a thriving population.
Right.
You need the right people in charge to make all that stuff happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how did they reconcile this very, like, meritocratic ideal with their system of model emulation?
Yeah.
Which seems very hierarchical, right?
Right. Because wouldn't that inherently favor the people who are already in power?
Yeah.
And it's a really good point, and there's definitely some tension there. But I think they seem to have believed that true worthiness would shine through regardless of someone's starting point.
Okay.
So rulers had this moral duty to identify and to promote talent, even if it meant elevating like commoners
Wow.
to positions of authority.
So a real belief in the power of merit to transcend like social barriers.
Exactly.
It sounds incredibly progressive for their time.
It really does, yeah.
Did they have any practical guidelines about how to actually identify and promote these worthy individuals?
Well, they didn't lay out like specific procedures,
Okay.
but their writings suggest it was a combination of observation, testing, and recommendation.
I see.
So superiors were expected to constantly be evaluating their subordinates, looking for signs of talent, looking for signs of virtue, always on the lookout for those hidden gems, so to speak.
So it's like a continuous talent search, always scouting for potential.
Yeah.
But
Right.
even with the best of intentions, wouldn't it be really tough to completely eliminate bias and create this truly level playing field?
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, achieving perfect meritocracy is still a challenge, even for us today.
Right, right.
But I think the very fact that the Mohists grappled with these issues and proposed such a radical system really speaks volumes about their commitment to fairness and to good governance.
Yeah, it's that willingness to challenge the status quo
Mm.
and envision a better system that makes them so fascinating.
Yeah.
Even if their ideal state might seem a little bit utopian. I think there are still some really valuable lessons to be learned from that thought experiment.
I agree, absolutely. I think their emphasis on shared values, on moral leadership, and on meritocracy resonates with a lot of the challenges that we still face today.
Right.
And it reminds us that building a just and harmonious society takes more than just laws and institutions. It
Yeah.
actually demands ethical conduct and a commitment to reasoned dialogue.
It's like they're offering this like timeless blueprint for a better world, even if the path to get there is like complex and messy.
For sure.
Now, in our final segment, let's talk about the legacy of Mohism.
Okay.
What happened to this really fascinating school of thought?
Yeah.
Did their ideas actually survive, or did they just kind of fade into obscurity?
Right.
Stay with us.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. So we spent the last couple of segments really getting into the nitty-gritty of Mohism, the unique concepts like Z and Fa, their ethical and political framework, their approach to logic, all this really cool stuff. But every philosophy has its own story, right? It's kind of like a rise and fall. So what ultimately became of Mohism?
Right.
Did it stand the test of time, or did it kind of just vanish into the footnotes of history?
It's a bit of a philosophical mystery, actually, because Mohism was a major force during the Warring States period.
Right.
But its influence really seemed to wane after China was unified under the Qin dynasty. It's almost like the very order that they were striving for ended up being their undoing.
It's almost ironic.
Yeah.
The master strategists outsmarted by history.
Right.
But I guess once you have a unified empire, you don't need as many people who specialize in defensive warfare and diplomacy and all that stuff.
That's true.
Was that the main reason for their decline, do you think?
It was definitely a factor, but also the Qin and then later the Han dynasty, they really favored Confucianism,
Okay.
which gradually became like the dominant ideology. So in a way, the Mohists kind of lost out in the battle of ideas.
The philosophical showdown for the ages.
Right.
But is it really as simple as like one school winning and the other one just disappearing?
Right.
Ideas kind of have a way of sticking around, even if their original proponents don't.
That's true, yeah. It's not that clean cut. Because a lot of Mohist ideas were actually absorbed into other schools, including Confucianism itself.
Okay.
So, for example, that concept of Jnai, inclusive care,
Right.
we start seeing that popping up in Confucian texts
I see.
towards the end of the Warring States period. And then by the Han Dynasty, you have Confucian scholars who are interpreting their own core virtue of Ren, benevolence,
Right.
through this very distinctly Mohist lens.
So even though Mohism as like a distinct school might have faded away, its philosophical DNA was kind of woven into the tapestry of Chinese thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they left this lasting imprint, even if their name wasn't always attached. Were there any other reasons for their decline besides just the political stuff and the rise of Confucianism?
Well, their later texts, what are called the Mohist canons, they're incredibly dense and challenging,
Oh, wow.
even for seasoned
Oh,
philosophers.
I see.
So this made them much less accessible to the average person, and I think that also contributed to their fading influence.
It's like they wrote themselves into a corner, philosophically speaking.
Kinda, yeah.
So a mix of political shifts, the rise of Confucianism, and then also this kind of esoteric nature of their later works all kind of led to Mohism's downfall. It is kind of a philosophical tragedy when you think about it.
It is, but I think it's important to remember that their contributions were significant.
Mm.
I mean, they developed China's first systematic ethical and political theories.
Mm.
They introduced this whole idea of consequentialism.
Right.
They engaged in incredibly sophisticated arguments about language and knowledge and logic. They were true pioneers,
Wow.
even if they haven't gotten the lasting recognition that they probably deserve.
It makes you wonder how history might have unfolded differently if things had gone another way.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about.
But hey, maybe that's why we're here,
Right.
right? Rediscovering these kind of forgotten gems of philosophical thought.
Exactly, and thankfully there's been a resurgence of interest in Mohism in recent decades.
Oh, really?
Yeah, both in China and in the West. Scholars are really starting to realize how much we can still learn from these ancient thinkers.
It's like they're having this philosophical comeback tour after centuries of neglect.
Right.
What do you think is driving this renewed interest?
Well, I think there's a growing appreciation for the diversity of Chinese philosophical traditions.
Mhm.
We're moving beyond this kind of Confucian-centric view
Right.
and recognizing the unique contributions of other schools like
Wow.
Mohism.
I see.
And then also there's just this growing interest in cross-cultural philosophy in general,
Right.
looking to non-Western traditions for fresh perspectives on these age-old problems that philosophers have been grappling with for millennia.
So Mohism is offering this new lens, in a way,
Yeah.
through which to examine those questions.
Hmm.
What do you think are some of the key takeaways for us today?
Hmm.
What can we learn from the Mohists?
Well, I think they remind us that there are multiple ways to approach philosophical questions.
Mhm.
Their focus on practicality, on social harmony, on the well-being of all, offers a really valuable alternative
Right.
to some of the more individualistic or abstract approaches that we often see in Western philosophy.
Yeah.
They also exemplified the power of rigorous argumentation and critical thinking.
Right.
I mean, they were masters of logic and debate, and perhaps most importantly, I think they really inspire us to envision a better world
Right.
where social order arises not from coercion,
Hmm.
but from shared values and a commitment to the common good.
It's powerful stuff. It's like they're offering us this roadmap, not just for understanding the past, but also for navigating the present
Right.
and building a better future.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us on this philosophical journey.
Yeah.
And we encourage all of our listeners to keep exploring,
Right.
delve deeper into the world of Mohism, and see what resonates with you.
Remember, as the Mohists taught us, the quest for knowledge and wisdom is a never-ending journey.
Very true.
So keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better world.
Until next time, happy philosophizing, everyone.